Hello, this is Ariadne Rainbird, and today I'm going to be talking about Anglo-Saxon heathenry and discussing what we know about Anglo-Saxon heathenry and whether it is actually possible to reconstruct Anglo-Saxon heathenry for modern day pagans or heathens to practice. Although many modern pagans consider their religion to be concerned with practice rather than belief, modern heathens often base their religious practice on the literary sources, largely the Icelandic materials, the poetic and prose Eddas and the Icelandic sagas. Beliefs are often based on the stories of the gods in these literary sources. Asatru UK state on their website, there are literary sources that tell us how heathenry was practiced before the advent of Christianity. The main sources include medieval Icelandic Eddas and sagas, Anglo-Saxon poetry, the works of the 8th century English monk Saint Bede, and the Germania by the Roman historian Tacitus. Although most of these were written in Christian times, they record the religious beliefs and practices of a culture that existed before Christianity came to Northern Europe. Archaeological evidence continues to be discovered which supports this picture of heathen religion obtained from such classical and medieval literature. So, although archaeological sources are also mentioned in this extract, the emphasis is clearly on the literary sources, with the archaeological sources being considered as supplementary. Whilst this might not be the case for all heathens, emphasis on the written sources does seem to predominate. This emphasis on literary sources poses a problem for those who wish to revive or reconstruct Anglo-Saxon heathenry, due to the lack of original sources and the many changes brought about by later Christian influences. The main literary source for Anglo-Saxon paganism in England is the 8th century CE Christian monk Bede, who was writing well into the Christian period, and his reliability as a source on Anglo-Saxon heathen beliefs and practices is therefore questionable. If there is no reliable literary source, is it possible to revive or reconstruct Anglo-Saxon paganism? If we are to attempt such a revival or reconstruction, what evidence do we have at our disposal? And are those sources sufficient for a satisfactory reconstruction? These are questions which I will attempt to address in this presentation. So in order to answer these questions, we must first establish who the Anglo-Saxons were. Anglo-Saxon paganism refers to the practices of Germanic settlers in England from around 450 CE to around 700 CE. These settlers were not a single people, but various tribes of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from Germany and from southern Scandinavia, who arrived in small and unconnected parties over a period of several years, rather than there being an invasion by one specific group of people at one time. These settlers brought with them their own ancestral traditions and customs, and settled in small and distinct tribal colonies. In 597 CE, Gregorian missionaries came to England and introduced the Germanic settlers to Nicene Christianity. However, this would not have been the settlers' first encounter with Christianity, as Christianity had been introduced to Britain under Roman rule. And after the Romans withdrew, the British people in the west of England and Wales continued to practice what is often termed Celtic Christianity, a combination of traditional Roman Catholicism with ancient indigenous customs, beliefs, and rituals, which included remnants of Celtic paganism. Thus, the Germanic settlers, as well as having diverse practices themselves because they were all different tribes, encountered various different cultural practices and ideologies, both through mixing with the British people and their version of Christianity, as well as Celtic pagan customs, and through the new missions sent from Rome. The South Saxons converted to Christianity in 686 CE, and at this point, Christianization was politically complete. Writing after this conversion, the monk Bede described these disparate Germanic groups as gens Anglorum. It should be remembered, though, that even if England was now politically completely converted to Christianity. That doesn't mean that every person was a practicing Christian, and pagan practices likely continued, but also a mix of pagan and Christian practices did continue for a long time, and still do, really. Brennan, writing in 2021, argues that when Roman missionaries came to convert the Anglo-Saxons, due to their previous experiences with the Franks, Goths, and Lombards, that they would have found the most effective method of conversion would be to present the new religion as a set of more effective ritual actions for creating relationship with the divine, replacing one tribal cult with a new one. This would then have been followed by convincing the people that the new triune God was worthy of worship, replacing their established myths of gods and heroes with the Holy Trinity. English Christianity incorporated Anglo-Saxon traditions, and even god names such as Woden became synonymous with the biblical patriarchs. Brennan argues that due to being recent settlers and a diverse group, that the Anglo-Saxons were open to adopting a new cult which supported their sense of identity, but also allowed for them to develop an identity of their own, a new identity in their new land. Due to the tension between traditionalism and innovation, which is so often characteristic of settler societies. These people were separated from their old traditional places of worship and from their wider social and kinship groups, and were meeting with new people in a new land. And in practically every pagan tradition, connection with the land and with the ancestors is vitally important, and these people were disconnected from both. Brennan argues that they likely had a need to develop cohesion and to find some kind of commonality and tribal identity, so that these diverse tribes could become one people. And as a result, they would have been open to adopting a new cult practice, which gave identity and a new infrastructure, and allowed the disparate groups to be bound together by a new form of religion, which transcended the tribal differences. There is a sparsity of literature from pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon times. No written material exists which we can reliably say came from a heathen or from someone who was a contemporary eyewitness to heathenry. All existing Anglo-Saxon literature post-dates the conversion, showing various stages of the effects of Christianization, even if the people were not fully converted. However, studies of Anglo-Saxon language could shed light on their religious beliefs. Brennan, writing in 2021, focuses on word families related to worship in the Anglo-Saxon language and compares them to religious terms in other Germanic languages. He also explores how Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons affected common religious terminology. Brennan argues that the impact of Christianity produced new concepts and changed the concept of worship from its practical and communal function, and created an orthodoxy and orthopraxy, dictating what was correct belief and form of worship. Brennan argues that there were two phases to this change, the first being led by Christian missionaries, and the second phase occurred once a clerical infrastructure had been established in England. In this second phase, common religious language was transformed by religious texts. Brennan discusses how folklore and vernacular language has been used in the past as a way of exploring religious beliefs. He refers to Jacob Grimm, who gathered together German folk tales and believed that they were continuations from earlier Germanic heathen religion. Brennan argues that there was a focus on the mythopoetic as expression of culture and cult practice. Due to the emphasis on myth and literature as expressions of religious belief, studies of Germanic religion focused on Scandinavian, due to the myths being preserved in the poetic and prose Eddas. However, two studies of Anglo-Saxon mythology were undertaken in the 1920s by Richard Gente, who studied terminology and mythological expressions in Old English vocabulary, and Ernst Philipson, who sought to explore Anglo-Saxon mythology and language. Brennan argues that evidence for paganism in linguistic studies, when interpreted along with archaeological evidence, folklore, and comparative religious studies, and the study of place names, can increase our understanding of the religion of the Anglo-Saxons. The study of pagan religious elements in language was revisited in the 1990s by Richard North, who produced 2 volumes on the subject. Brennan states that the Anglo-Saxon heathens had 3 nouns, which denoted sacred objects, with weo being most clearly used for a being who was revered. The word was marginalised in Christian times and interpreted as the word idol. Brennan suggests that a heathen may have considered a weo to have been an object which allowed contact with a divine or ancestral being revered, a weodion, by the community. The word beam or biam appears in Anglo-Saxon poetry, such as The Dream of the Rood, which describes the poet's vision of a wondrous tree spreading aloft, spun with light. And Brennan argues that it may be considered a religious term due to trees being cult foci to the Anglo-Saxon heathens. Terms such as biero and lea describe woodland as sacred space to the heathens. When the words beam and biero appear together, they suggest that wood from a sacred forest has been used to create a sacred object. Brennan argues that the poetic usage of these terms was often opposed in the early 8th century due to the Christian dislike of idolatry. Brennan discusses a number of other Anglo-Saxon religious terms which were either adopted and repurposed by Christianity or rejected. However, Brennan argues scholarly focus is now upon cult and worship rather than myth and belief. Thor Ewing argues that myth is just one ideological factor within a culture's religious expression, and that the religion was primarily expressed through practice, that is, what they did as opposed to what they believed. Many modern pagans also claim that paganism is about practice, not belief. However, storytelling is also a practice which is important to many cultures and often preserves ancestral mythic histories which binds cultures together. This is something which we have largely lost in modern times, and we could also question whether the myths told by the Norse people or those told long ago by Germanic settlers in England are really our myths, or whether we should have our own, which are more relevant to our own lives and families. Myths were likely dynamic rather than static, and variable between diverse groups of people. Brennan argues that the complex mosaic of overlapping worldviews strongly challenges the assumption that pre-Christian belief as a unity can be discovered through myth. Brennan argues that it is better to examine the practices of individual worshippers, family traditions, and regional cults. The Anglo-Saxon settlers in England did not write with the Latin alphabet, but did use runic inscriptions. There were various runic alphabets, and the Anglo-Saxon variant is called the Futhorc, because of Old English pronunciation. There are about 30 known Anglo-Saxon runes, which have been found on manuscripts and inscribed on objects, but the systems do vary depending on the different inscriptions in different places. And it may be that the different tribes had variation in their forms of runes that they brought over. The Riddle in Old English Runes, an article on the University College London website, says that each rune can indicate a single letter or sound or represent a full word, and many runes can have multiple meanings. Personal names written in runes can be found on coins or personal objects. The article states that personal names and some pagan gods may also have their own runes, but that these attributions have been contested. A number of items with recognisable runes on them, dated from the 4th century to the 11th century CE, have been discovered, with inscriptions on religious items and other items. The earliest runic inscription is on a cremation urn in Norfolk, which is pictured here, and dates to the 4th to 5th century CE. However, most surviving runic inscriptions date to the Christian period, notably the Kingmore ring, also depicted here, a solid gold ring dated to the 9th century CE, which may have inspired Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and is inscribed with 30 runes in a string of letters which is untranslatable. The first few letters, however, spell the Old English word Ercrio, a word which appears in Bald's Leech Book, and this word is thought to be part of a magical charm. So despite being from the Christian era and well into the Christian era, it shows that magic was still part of tradition. The Kingmore ring, then, although made in Christian times, may be a magical amulet. With the advent of Christianity, runes were replaced by the Latin alphabet, and the runes may have fallen out of favour due to their pagan roots, symbolism, and some of the objects they appear on. No altars, statues, or inscribed names of gods have been discovered, however. Early Germanic paganism was written about by Roman writers such as Tacitus, who described heathen rites among the Rhineland tribes in the 1st century CE. However, we cannot assume that the 5th century settlers in England had exactly the same practices. Equally, we cannot assume that the heathen myths of the Icelandic poetry came from a fixed and universal heathen religion, and we must be cautious when using the Scandinavian literature to study the beliefs of the Anglo-Saxons. The study of place names can tell us something of the Anglo-Saxon heathen religion, as the names of heathen gods have survived in English place names, as well as in the English names for the days of the week, and in the claimed ancestry of English kings. The god Woden appears not only in the word Wednesday, but in many place names such as Wednesfield in Staffordshire, Wodensfield in Gloucestershire, Wodensfeld and Wenseyfield, which were both once field names in Essex. And Owen, 1981, argues that this implies that open areas of land were sacred to Woden. A number of hills are also named after Woden, such as Woodensborough and Worms Hill, and Wodensdean in Wiltshire, suggests a valley named after Woden. We cannot assume that heathen temples existed in these places, as there's no archaeological evidence for the same. But Owen argues that the settlers may have named landmarks after their god, without necessarily seeing them as sacred places. It's also, however, possible, and in my opinion more likely, that the landscape itself was seen as sacred, without the need for temples to be built. Owen argues that the settlers may have assumed that features of the landscape, which they could not have built themselves, were the work of gods or giants, and existing earthworks were also named after Woden, such as Wansdyke. A number of British place names also contain the name Grim, another name for Woden or Odin, which, according to Owen, derives from the belief that Woden would often appear in disguise, the word grimma meaning a mask, visor, or helmet. Places such as Grimsby and Grimsdyke are named after Grim. Woden is the Anglo-Saxon version of the Norse Odin and Germanic Wotan, but whereas Odin is depicted in Norse art as having only one eye due to the myth of him giving up his eye to attain the runes, Woden is depicted in art with 2 eyes, suggesting a difference in mythology. Owen, however, quotes an Old English prose text which contains a dialogue about the creation of the world, which contains the lines, "Tell me, who first set the letters? I tell thee, Mercurius the giant." Mercurius is the god who the Romans equated Woden with. And these lines suggest that the Anglo-Saxons also associated Woden with the secrets of the runes. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem also tells us that the rune Os, meaning God, and likely referring to Woden, is the origin of all speech, which may also refer to Woden as the giver of the runes. Owen states that the word Aesir, the name of the family of gods that the Scandinavian Odin belongs to, may also survive in English place names such as Easerfield, Coppice in Worcestershire. Woden is also mentioned in the 11th century Anglo-Saxon 9 herbs charm, a charm against snakebite. A snake came creeping, it winded someone. Then Woden took 9 glory twigs and struck the snake so that it flew into 9 pieces. These are from lines 119 to 20, quoted in Owen. Owen states that the glory twigs referred to runic symbols which represented the herbs. Frigga, Woden's wife, appears in place names such as Frobry and Froyle in Hants, and Frethern in Gloucestershire, which means Frigga's thorn bush. Woden's son, Thunor, the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of the Norse god Thor, also appears in place names, particularly linked with the word lea, meaning a wood or grove, such as Thundersley and Thunderley Hall in Essex, and Thursley in Surrey. Thunor, unlike Woden, does not feature in English literature, but is still present in our words Thursday and thunder. Whereas Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, has a short handle, and there is a myth which explains why the handle is short, Thunor's hammer has a long handle, suggesting that there is no equivalent myth in Anglo-Saxon England. Amulets in the form of Thunor's hammer have been found in Anglo-Saxon burials from the 7th century CE, along with miniature spears, which were amulets of Woden. Swastikas were also associated with Thunor, and Owen suggests may have symbolised lightning. There is no evidence of Loki or Balder being known in Anglo-Saxon England, though stories of them were brought to Britain later by Viking settlers. It has been suggested that Bolsterston in Yorkshire is named after Balder, but Owen argues that it probably simply means a stone representing a bolster. Though a man named Bealdeg is mentioned as Woden's son in a West Saxon genealogy, and Balder's story may also be alluded to in the Beowulf poem, where one brother accidentally shoots another. Owen also suggests that Balder's story may have influenced the way the crucifixion is described in The Dream of Rude, an Anglo-Saxon poem. Chew, or Chewaz, continues in our modern word Tuesday, and according to Owen was probably the supreme deity before Woden or Odin took his place. Several place names include his name, such as Teesmere in Worcester, Tisley in Hunts, and Chewsley in Surrey. At Tiso in Warwickshire, a spur of land with the figure of a horse carved on it is named for him. Horses were likely linked with war, and Chew is a god of war as well as law and order. Chew's rune was carved on weapons for victory and has been found on an Anglo-Saxon spear pommel from Faversham and a spear from Holborough in Kent, and also appears on cremation urns. The Saxon god Saxnet may have been another name for Chew and was worshipped along with Thunor by continental Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon kings of Essex claimed Saxnet was their ancestor, whereas other kings took their genealogies back to Woden. A fertility god, Ing, is often equated with Freyr, as Freyr was known by names Ingvi and Ingunva in Iceland. The name of the god Frey does not appear in English place names, but is related to the Old English word Freya, meaning Lord, which was used for the Christian god Freyr and his twin sister Freya. Were both associated with boars. Freya and his twin sister Freya were both associated with boars, and boars appear a lot in Anglo-Saxon art. Ship burials were also associated with Freya, and ship burials were carried out in Anglo-Saxon England, such as that at Sutton Hoo. It's also of note that different gods appear more frequently in place names inhabited by the different peoples who made up Anglo-Saxon England, suggesting that the different peoples worshipped different gods or placed different levels of importance on the different gods. So different tribes may have seen different gods from the pantheon as being more important and worshipped them more as their tribal god. Owen argues that an earth goddess was also likely worshipped in Anglo-Saxon England. likely similar to Nerthus in continental Europe, described by Tacitus, and that this is preserved in the 11th century field blessing charm, which makes a plea to both the Christian god and the Earth Mother. Bede tells us that the heathens celebrated Modrenecht, or Mother's Night, on 25th of December, and Owen says that this may have indicated a cult of Mother Earth, though it is generally celebrated by modern heathens as a night for honouring the female ancestors and goddesses. The mothers may also have been a group of goddesses similar to those who appeared earlier in Roman Britain as 3 or sometimes 4 female figures. Such figures were also known in the Germanic world and may be associated with the Norns. Bede also mentions 2 other goddesses, Hreda and Eostre, who each had a month named after them, equated with March and April respectively. Hreda means glory or fame, and Eostre is related to the word east. Semple, in Signals of Belief in Early England, chapter 2, discusses written sources of the conversion and post-conversion period which condemn or prohibit certain practices as heathen, and thus tell us something of heathen religion. The veneration of natural places, such as wells, trees, and stones, is often condemned by Christian preachers. Semple argues that the landscape was sacred and that monuments were a way of writing new ideologies and identities into the landscape, and were part of an active process of myth-making. She argues that the idea that there was a distinction between the sacred and the secular must be questioned, and that sacred sites may not have been set aside from settlements or cemeteries. Field rituals, healing charms, and spells survive in Christian sources, and activities such as ploughing, planting, harvesting, and creating boundaries may all have included ritual activity related to beliefs. Semple argues that no society exists in a vacuum, and that we need to look to not only Scandinavia and Iceland, but also to the Balkans, Russia, and beyond to help us to interpret and contextualize Anglo-Saxon religion and culture. We must also look to prehistoric and Roman practices in England, as all human activity is affected by what has happened in the past. Semple also discusses place names, particularly those associated with supernatural creatures such as elves, which are associated with hills, valleys, and wild places. Texts such as Beowulf describe beliefs in supernatural beings, and dark places such as its hollows and clefts in rock and pits, which are sometimes named after spirits, such as Grendel's Pit in Devon, Thur's Pit in Marcliffe, and Puka Pit in Sussex. Though we do not know what their beliefs were about them, whether they were venerated or feared, or a mix of both. But in Christian times, they may have been seen as negative and informed ideas of hell. A water spirit, Nicor, appears in field names such as Nicapole in Wiltshire and Nicapole in Sussex. Watery places could also be gateways to the other world, as they are in many other cultures. But there is evidence of ritual activity at springs and wells. Deposits of metalwork have been found in rivers and lakes, similar to those found from Iron Age times. Trees, shrubs, stones, and wells were also designated as holy places, and votive deposits or remains of structures have been found that mark them out as sacred places. Such structures are not necessarily temples, but monuments that mark a place as sacred. Fields and groves are often dedicated to certain deities, and hilltops, particularly those which are hidden or peripheral in vision, may be particularly sacred. Tissue in Surrey, for example, is a distinctive spur which is named after Tew. The Old English word heog means temple or shrine, and place names containing heog are often associated with hidden hilltops or a whaleback of land. For example, Harrow on the Hill in Middlesex and Harrow Hill in Sussex both are hills rising out of deep valleys, which cannot be seen from a distance. Semple argues that the hidden nature of these sacred hills could increase their dramatic impact and therefore spiritual power, just as the climb to the top could be seen as a spiritual quest. Walker, in chapter 5 of Signals of Belief, discusses the idea that Anglo-Saxon religious rituals took place in high-status buildings or halls. She argues that rituals may have sometimes taken place in a general purpose role for political or social reasons, or a general purpose hall for political or social reasons, but that at other times religious activity took place in a building separate from the general hall. This could be seen as being the same as religion today, which has a wide variety of forms, with large religious gatherings sometimes taking place in public buildings. Semple says that it was long thought that the Anglo-Saxons did not have temples, but that more recent discoveries, such as those at Yevering and at Rendlesham, suggest that temple structures did exist, but were often built over by Christian churches. Price, in his foreword to Signals of Belief, quotes the Sermon of the Wolf, the Wolf of the English, given by Archbishop Wulfstan of York, blaming the collapse of English society on people straying from Christianity and on Wiccan and Valkyrian, which is often translated as sorcerers and witches, but would more accurately be translated as witches and Valkyries. It is not known if Valkyries in England had the same role as Valkyries in Scandinavian myth. Medieval writers in England refer to Valkyries and to female sorcerers or shamanistic women. Burials from Anglo-Saxon pagan times, such as the Cunning Woman burial from the 6th century in Bidford-on-Avon, depicted here, included brooches, a knife, glass and amber beads, and tiny bucket-shaped pendants. Helen Geek, cited by Carver, 2010, suggested that this woman was a healer and guardian of the cemetery, with the idea that just as women are responsible for bringing people into the world through birth, they would also birth them into the next world. Carver argues, however, that ritual and religion can only be seen if there are material remains, and so we are limited to examining rich burials and high investment sites, which don't tell us about the everyday practices and beliefs of the people, and tell us more about politics than religion. There are also problems with equating one period of history with what happened before it and after it, and with comparisons with other contemporary cultures or current cultures with which we see a similarity. Carver warns that although the literature is inspiring, it also has limited use because it is not contemporary, whereas archaeological data is contemporary but incomplete. Although cross-referencing different methods may provide for more accuracy, we may still be misinterpreting, as a particular object may have different meanings in different contexts. Carver argues that another problem is the idea that there was something called Anglo-Saxon paganism at all, or that it could be defined as one thing. Anglo-Saxon England did not exist. There was no one people called the Anglo-Saxons. There were diverse tribes. And neither did Anglo-Saxon paganism. There was no one religion. There were diverse practices, cult practices, and beliefs. Organised Christian institutions did not exist in Britain during this period either, and did not exist until there was a united Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Rather, a variety of peoples, each with their own practices and beliefs, who each had their own ancestral memories and memories of their own lands, lived in Britain. They would have come into contact with other peoples, such as the Scandinavians prior to coming to England, and once settled, had a new land and new landscape to incorporate into their lifestyle and cult practices, as well as contact with other groups of settlers with different customs to their own, plus their contact with British and Romano-Celtic culture and religion. And even prior to coming to Britain, the Germanic peoples would have had contact with Celtic cultures in the Germanic kingdoms. Carver argues that neither paganism nor Christianity existed in an institutionalized form, and there was no uniformity of belief or practice, but rather there were a wide variety of metaphysical and intellectual ideas and practices. Carver describes it as an age of the unorthodox, and that religious practitioners and leaders could be pluralistic and inventive. Carver argues that neither paganism nor Christianity were homogeneous, and I would argue that they're not today either, as we are reverting back to a situation of people finding their own way and path. Whereas a study of place names, archaeology, literature and language can give us quite a lot of information about Anglo-Saxon religious practice and belief, we do not have the rich mythological sources that exist in Norse heathenry. But does this matter? Anglo-Saxon heathenry was not homogeneous, and it is unlikely that Norse heathenry was homogeneous and unchanging either. Myths were likely fluid until such time as they were written down. And in some ways, it's a shame that they were. If they'd been preserved more in oral tradition, there would have been a lot more varieties and changes. Or perhaps I should say it's more a shame that more versions of the myths weren't written down. Because once something is put in writing and it's the only source, it kind of becomes like a gospel, it becomes the book. And that's not what pagan religions were ever really about. Myths were likely fluid until such time as they were written down. And unlike the Christian mythology, the myths are not scripture, which must be taken as it is and believed. Carver argues that if the Prittlewell prince, a high-status Anglo-Saxon burial which included Christian and pagan artefacts, were asked whether he was pagan or Christian, that he would answer, "I trust I'm neither, and let's pray that we never get to the point that we are obliged to declare such a crude choice of allegiance. My burial proclaims the intellectual autonomy of my family, its history, my record as a soldier and estate owner, my broad knowledge of prehistory, my taste, my pride in my people, our inheritance, the current preoccupations of our intellectual arena, our political aspirations and fears." Perhaps we as pagans should think in a similar manner and stop worrying about the labels. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and if you have enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe to my channel.